Hey, good day, everyone. I'm Daniel O'Malley. I'm the Deputy Editor and Digital Policy Specialist at the Center for International Media Assistance, which is housed at the National Endowment for Democracy. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, A New Battlefront, the effect of commercial spyware on independent media. Recent revelations have shown that the impact of commercial spyware is far greater than many had previously realized and understood. And we hope that this panel will shed even more information on the consequences of the proliferation of this technology in diverse news media ecosystems worldwide, and also what might need to be done in order to stop its spread and its use. We hope that this conversation will be engaging for you today, and we encourage you to use Zoom's Q&A feature. So please submit any questions you have during the course of this discussion. And there will be an extended Q&A section at the end of the panel, and we'll do our best to incorporate your thoughts and questions into the discussion. I now have the honor of introducing today's moderator, and that is CIMA's Senior Director Nick Benaquista. Nick has recently joined CIMA as our new Senior Director. Nick draws from extensive experience in international media development, applied research, democracy support, and journalism. He's been a foreign correspondent in 3 countries, including Mexico as Bloomberg's City Bureau Chief. And he has overseen policy research projects around the globe with the UK's Institute of Development Studies and Canada's International Development Research Centre. He's also been an advisor and consultant to multilateral organizations such as IDEA and UNESCO. He's the author and editor of numerous publications, including a CIMA publication a couple of years ago that's titled International Media Development, Historical Perspectives and New Frontiers. So as you can see, we're absolutely delighted to have Nick as our Senior Director, and it's an honor for me to introduce him today on the first panel that he'll be moderating in his role as Senior Director. I'm going to pass it over to you, Nick.
Thanks. I'm really happy you guys at CIMA. And thanks to everybody for attending this morning or this afternoon or evening, depending on where you're hailing from. If you all have not yet updated your operating system on your iPhone, I suspect you'll want to after hearing today's panel. It is a very timely topic coming on the heels of really troubling allegations that I'm sure you've all read in the press about the abuse of NSO Group's Pegasus Spyware by authoritarian states and actors. It's important to note that while NSO Group does contest these claims, the growing number of episodes related to the abuse of spyware has been a stark reminder of the risk that these poorly regulated technologies pose, with journalists and their sources prominent on the list of targets. NSO Group, of course, is just one company in a growing spyware industry comprised of an estimated 500 companies globally, catering to a $12 billion market. Cyberbit, FinFisher, Hacking Team, Candiro, Gamma International, or many of the other names I'm sure you've heard associated with spyware. We at CIMA, with the assistance of the author, Sam Woodhams, recently published a report, as Dan mentioned, Spyware, an unregulated and escalating threat to independent media, looking at the abuse of spyware and how it creates a chilling effect, has a form of self-censorship on journalists and their sources, how it creates a heavy burden and cost for independent news outlets, particularly small outlets in the global south, and how it endangers the safety and well-being of journalists. So today we've got a really excellent panel to hear about how this kind of technology has come to be so widely available in the hands of repressive governments and other actors who would use spyware for nefarious purposes. How this technology is different and far more insidious than previous forms of spyware. And of course, looking at it through the implications for journalists and hopefully talking a little bit about some of the options for countering the threat and protecting journalists and their sources from this threat. I'd like to read you a quote The reckless and abusive use of commercial spyware to target journalists, their associates, and their families adds to the numerous and growing risks that journalists worldwide now face. Media organizations and investigative journalists are important information, including information on sources that threaten powerful actors. Thanks to companies like autocrats now have a powerful tool to aid their sinister aims to stifle dissent and quell controversial reporting. So that's a quote from one of our panelists, Ron Diebert, from 3 years ago. Let me introduce our panelists, starting with Professor Diebert, who is the director of the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Through the Citizens Lab's digital forensics work, we have learned a great deal about the existence of spyware and its existence and its use against journalists, civil society, and so we know much more than we would have about this very secretive industry. And Ron has been sounding an alarm with regard to the spyware industry for years, as that quote implies. We also have with us today Alia Ibrahim, who is the co-founder and CEO of a Lebanon-based independent digital media platform. That platform was launched in 2017. Daraj was a regional partner of the Pegasus project. So that was a consortium of over 80 media outlets that helped to bring to light the recent revelations about the abuse of the Pegasus spyware. Previously, Daraj was also a partner in the ICIJ-led Paradise Papers series, you may remember. Alia will be brings with us some, firsthand account as well as a news outlet that has been targeted in the past. Tanja Maksic is a program manager at the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, Bern, Serbia. This is an organization that trains journalists and advocates for policy reforms that benefit independent media. Tanja has been with Bern for over a decade and has been leading research on the impact of spyware in the Balkan region, and she'll be sharing some of those insights with us today. And finally, we have Sam Woodhams, who's a digital rights researcher, the author of the report that we recently launched, and a freelance journalist based in London. His work, which I would encourage you to check out, focuses on the democratic governance. He's written for Wired, Quartz, done work for Al Jazeera and CNN, and we're really pleased to have Sam and all other terrific panelists today. So to kick things off, I'd like to start if you could give us some clarity on what we're dealing with today in terms of the technology. So you've been following this technology. How has it evolved, to get to the, really hard to detect insidious forms of spyware that we have today? Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Nick, and glad to be here with everybody on this panel. Yeah, so as you say, we've been researching this area for quite a while. Actually, I was just thinking, it's a decade ago this year that we published the first report on commercial spyware. For us at the Citizen Lab, we have been interested for many years in how governments are using surveillance technologies and surveillance generally, targeted espionage, to go after civil society, after political opposition and so forth. And a market started emerging, I would say in the 2010s, for this type of service. So there are many governments that can do these type of things in-house, but a market emerged around this time to do it for them. And I think there are a number of triggering factors historically. First and foremost, I think the Arab Spring and other social movements like it that were digitally enabled, that were showing the ways in which mobile technologies, social media could be used to organize protests and mobilize people. And of course, the demonstration effect of what was accomplished in many countries in the Middle East and North Africa during the Arab Spring, to put it simply, freaked people out, freaked autocrats out. And so they went out and said, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? Lo and behold, there was this private market for commercial surveillance technologies that started to sprout up. The next big sequence of events, at least as far as I'm concerned, was the Snowden Disclosures. These had an unintended impact. So, of course, Snowden is very much against this industry. I'm not saying this is deliberate, but the revelations, the disclosures of the powerful capabilities that the NSA, GCHQ, and other signals intelligence agencies had the kind of unintended effect of like a like a catalog. And again, I think governments were saying, hey, how do we get our hands on something like this? Because those look pretty powerful. And they turned to their security agencies, who went out to the private marketplace. The technology hasn't evolved considerably from the point where in the early 2010s, 2011, 2012, companies' surveillance technology worked by tricking targets into doing something. So you would receive an email with an attachment, and it contains some sort of malware that exploits a vulnerability in your software or operating system. So a lot of the effort had to go into social engineering to send a message to somebody saying, hey, this is a message from somebody click here, either a text message or an attachment, and it would infect their device that way. The latest iteration of NSO's Pegasus Spyware, and there are other versions of it with other companies, requires absolutely no interaction on the part of the target. It's known as a zero-click version of the software, meaning that you don't have to click on anything. And again, here, the reasoning behind this, why this is happening. We live in a digital ecosystem that is invasive by design, right? This is surveillance capitalism. We all carry around with us these devices 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which are engineered primarily to follow us around and vacuum up data from us. That's very irresistible for somebody who wants to follow somebody else to get access to that equipment and be able to kind of piggyback off of it. But it's very poorly regulated and insecure. Mark Zuckerberg had this famous mantra, move fast and break things. That's kind of the philosophy of social media. Applications, versions of applications are pushed out continuously, and inevitably there's going to be some bug or flaw in the software. On the other side of the equation, you have these companies which are valued in some cases well over $1 billion that can go out and hire very specialized engineers who do nothing all day except scour those applications and operating systems for that little vulnerability that they can exploit to take over a person's device. I'm sure we'll get into, in our conversation today, some of the factors around why this market is leading to so much abuse. It's very poorly regulated. There virtually is no regulation around it in terms of mitigating harms. So we're seeing really a tsunami of abuses. And the Pegasus project, dramatically illustrated that we saw really a large number of these cases thanks to the work of Forbidden Stories journalists and Amnesty International.
Thanks a lot, Ron. This notion of a zero-click attack is really startling. Suggesting that it's very difficult to even train folks in a kind of digital hygiene to protect themselves against those who have the means to acquire these, most advanced technologies. You finished by mentioning the investigations that have, including by Forbidden Stories, that have revealed some of these abuses. We have with us today, as I mentioned, Alia Ibrahim, who was a part of that consortium with Forbidden Stories. So Alia, if you could, it would be great to hear from you about how that Pegasus project worked, how you came to be a part of it, why Daraj and not another organization, and if you could tell us a little bit about what you see from your perspective has happened as a result of some of the revelations that you brought to light.
Thanks, Nick. Really happy to be on this panel. I relate a lot with what Ron has been saying, but from the other side of the planet and on the other side of the spectrum too, as journalists and as people who are vulnerable users in that sense. First, let me say that I think that there is a couple of points that I would really like to make. First, as journalists and in terms of the coverage of the Pegasus project, why Daraj, not anybody else? Daraj has contributed with forbidden stories on previous collaborations and investigations. This has been happening for a few years, but let me put that into a larger context. If we look at the coverage of the Pegasus story, which by all means has made headlines all over the world. If we look at the coverage in the Arab world, in the Arabic language, particularly outside the coverage of the services that are owned by international media like BBC Arabic, DW Arabic, TRT, etc. If you look at the coverage of the mainstream media in Lebanon, leading in the Arab world, you would find a very minimal coverage, and in a lot of cases, it's very selective coverage in the sense that the mainstream media would pick stories that are relevant to its editorial policies and to the political agendas of its owners. This is not new. We're used to this. This is, I think, one of the reasons why Daraj was created in 2016, which came right after, in 2017, right after the Panama Papers, was out of the frustration and inspiration that the papers at the time did for journalists who saw that even when something so big, such collaborations could be happening at such a scale, there wouldn't be Arab mainstream media willing to publish, not to contribute, but to publish, which at the time meant that the Arabic speakers had to wait for days until they had, who did not speak another language, had to wait for days to learn about stories that are really very relevant. Some of the main stories came from the Arab world. This was really infuriating. In that sense, the presence of a partner from the Arab world meant a lot to us. From a logistical point of view, this was really difficult because on top of, we are working in an ecosystem that makes us, basically on what Ron was saying, we know already that we are greatly in a difficult place. If we look at the other side of it, which before I go and talk about the specificities, the impact, even if you look at what the stories meant, and we're talking here about really big stories, we're talking about stories that have to do with the Khashoggi case, we're talking about stories that have to do with Princess Latifa and Princess Haya, let alone the stories that have touched the lives of hundreds of journalists and workers in the human rights field, who for us as journalists are the priority, but I'm talking even in the sense of how big the stories were. The impact that we have seen even in terms of the actions from the Arab world is surreal given the size of the story. What we saw from Morocco, for example, which is really like the largest user of this of the Pegasus malware, what we saw is that instead of launching an investigation, they actually filed a defamation lawsuit against Amnesty International and against Forbidden Stories. On the same day the stories were published, our colleague Omar Radi was sentenced to prison. This is to tell you that there is really no obligation or accountability vis-a-vis the users or the citizens in this part of the world. The UAE and Saudi Arabia barely issued statements denying the factuality and saying this did not happen. And that was that. So in terms of impact, we really did not see much. All of this, if you put it in the context of what really that means for journalists and for workers in the human rights field, it's really, I'll be extremely honest, the idea of being spied on for individual journalists is almost normalized. I've been a journalist for 20 years. This idea of knowing that my phone is tapped, I mean, I can't remember the times I was joking while we would send messages to the people who are supposedly listening to us. But what we're seeing here is a completely different scale, and for many reasons. One of them is that as a journalist, you take the choice for yourself. You know what you're putting yourself into. When this happens, it's not just you. It's professionally, it's your sources that you are compromising. They are no longer willing to talk to you in the same way they used to. More importantly, it's the people you love. It's people who are close to you, whose lives and whose secrets and whose really very intimate details are exposed. And I would really like to, and today, just like recollecting my ideas, I reread a column that was written by our colleague in Morocco, Hajar Rassouni, who was spied on along with her husband. Both have left Morocco, but really rereading her words, what it meant. She already knew when she was contacted by Forbidden Story to test her phone. She knew that she has been spied on, because she said, I know that when I was investigated with, there were details that only a person who read my very personal diary on day-to-day basis would know. The same has happened with her husband. But then she goes on to say what this meant practically. And it meant that her uncle, who was also a journalist, who also was spied on, who also was arrested, the story of their family was not only exposed, it was also used to create more stories. And it was not only what they found, they used what they found to add to it a lot of details. And the way she puts it, they portrayed us as a morally ill family. And it became impossible for us to stay there. And even the people who trusted them, she talks about how friends stopped calling, how friends stopped visiting. Imagine this at the scale of even in the Arab world, where almost this idea of the intelligence, security forces being part of your daily life. This is a completely new level. And I cannot, and the last point I will make, expecting regulations to happen on our side of the world is really like being delusional about the realities of this part of the world. The minimum laws respecting privacy or human rights or freedom of speech or you name it are not there, let alone being capable of imposing regulations or trusting if they are being implemented. Transparency does not exist here. So if regulation has to be done at a global level, and I think that's what I wanted to say.
Alia, thanks very much. And I think you raised a point that we had discussed earlier in preparation for this, through the example you gave, which is this new form of spyware is, especially intrusive. All of your emails, all of your text messages, everywhere you've gone, your pictures on your phone. I mean, the most intimate details of our lives are on our phones now. And that does represent a serious escalation to having your phone tapped as a journalist. And I think the story you tell raises a point that you had been making earlier about women journalists being especially vulnerable to this kind of abuse of privacy and, to having these intimate details marshaled against them publicly in very sexist attacks, does represent a special risk for women journalists on top of all the other additional risks that women journalists face. So thanks for bringing that to light. And though you say it feels like there hasn't been a great response, in fact, on the contrary, facing a lawsuit from the Moroccan government, your efforts have been invaluable in bringing all of this to light. So thanks for all your hard work and courage in these investigations. Tanya, turning to you, let's go to Sam. I take that back. Sam, let's start for a moment with, how is it that this technology has come to be so widely available and abused? And, could you say a few words too about what you found in your report with regard to the implications for independent journalism?
Sure, thanks for having me. So I think Ron already highlighted some of the areas as to why this technology is so widely available and why it's being so widely abused. Obviously, there's a significant lack of meaningful regulation and constraints on both the sale and use of this technology. There's a clear absence of methods for redress for people that have been targeted. And overarching this element, I think, is the way that national security rhetoric has enabled governments and companies that are manufacturing this technology to conceal their activities. in terms of the impact that then, and the final point on that is that, a lot of the expertise and knowledge that is being drawn on by these companies to manufacture these products is being drawn on from Western intelligence agencies, whether they're former alumni of Israel's Unit 8200 or the NSA or similar ilk. There is a clear knowledge transfer from intelligence agencies into private corporations that are then manufacturing this technology. In my report, I was looking at both the direct impact this technology has on journalists when it is targeting them. And we've already heard a bit about how this technology can be used to locate, monitor, and ultimately arrest, or even be used to assist in the killing of members of the media. As well as that, and because of those abuses, what I found with talking to journalists based around the world is that the threat of this impact, this technology can have a terrorizing impact. Because people aren't sure whether they are being subject to surveillance or not, and because identifying whether they've been infected with this spyware or not is so difficult, it can create and encourage a sense of self-censorship, but more broadly, kind of socially conforming speech and behavior, and force some people to moderate their discourse, which is what I heard from certain individuals. We've also touched on the fact that this doesn't just impact journalists themselves, it also affects their ability to form relationships with sources, and their ability to maintain secure and confidential relationships with their sources. And this can create conditions in which sources may not feel comfortable coming forward, and journalists may not feel comfortable approaching those sources. So it works both ways. I think overall, the impact that it has and the potential impact it has is that we've seen that this technology is being used increasingly to kill the story and to control the free flow of information. And yeah, particularly within the report and the research that I was doing, we found that was particularly acute in conditions in which there were a variety of threats to freedom of expression. And I think one thing that's important to note is that spyware is not being deployed in a vacuum. There are multiple other, surveillance technologies out there, often that are a lot less expensive than spyware, and it needs to be considered within the broader realm of the surveillance technologies and that are being deployed against civil society. So I think that's all from me on that point.
Thanks, Sam. Sorry, I got dropped. My internet connection dropped out for a minute. It's just to follow up on one thing. The NSO Pegasus software. To be clear, how much does that cost? Just to give people a sense of the kinds of financial resources an actor would need to acquire that level of sophistication in their technology.
I think Ron might be best suited to answer that question.
Sure. Well, the basic answer is that it varies. It's sold as a licensing arrangement, and it depends on the number of targets that you want and the version that you want and the support that you may require, both on site and through infrastructure. So it varies quite widely. And of course, as Sam made a very good point that we should illustrate here, a lot of this is very secretive, right, by nature of the marketplace. So you can't just look up contracts. We're relying on leaked documents that come, or court proceedings, litigation proceedings. We might see some
Thanks. So Tanya, you've been looking into how all of this is playing out in Serbia and the Balkans, and based on what we've heard from you before, it sounds like the response is a little more hopeful than what Alia has encountered in the Middle East. Perhaps we can try to find at least some hope in this. But could you tell us a bit about how it's playing out, and also how the kinds of responses to the phenomenon that you've been seeing and working on also there at Bern, Serbia?
Yeah, well, thank you all. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you for having me at this panel. And this topic is becoming quite relevant, even if we are across the world from Alia. Actually, Pegasus project ring an alarm bell very close to home, because journalists in Hungary were also targeted through this spyware. Hungary is neighboring country to Serbia, but not just geographically. Hungary and Serbia are having similar media systems, meaning that both of our countries have autocratic and really undemocratic regimes in place, which are using spyware and other untransparent surveillance techniques to diminish media freedoms almost on daily basis. If you're not familiar, according to RSF Media Freedom Index, in European terms, Serbia is one of the countries that has seen one of the largest drops in media freedoms, and one of the largest declines in media freedoms according to their research. So you can imagine that deploying this type of technology actually brings yet another layer of problems, yet another layer of issues that we need to deal with. I just want to quickly to tell you actually about the case that we have about a year ago. Current Minister of Police, at that time Minister of Army, he actually issued a press statement reply to a certain news story, actually news commentary. What was the problem is that this news commentary was never published. His commentary clearly suggested that he had insight into this news story, into this commentary. But since the story was never published, the question was raised, how do you know about its content? So it actually prompted us at that point to look deeper into this matter and to research a little bit deeper about all the perils and all the problems that journalists are facing with. And this summer we organized focus groups with more than 20 journalists working in investigative centers and in independent local media outlets here in Serbia. And I just wanted to go quickly through the main findings that we got through this research. And they are very much in line with what Alia just mentioned. So being surveillanced is sort of new normalcy for the media outlets, for the newsrooms. It's the new reality that journalists are living in. They are all very much aware of potential intrusion of privacy, misuse of their personal and private data, that the protection of their sources could be jeopardized, as well as the leaks of the story could also be possible. However, journalists in Serbia still perceive that they are not direct targets of this surveillance. However, they feel that people that they are meeting with as part of their journalistic work, such as people working in high political circles or in public enterprises or coming from the criminal scene even, are actually the primary targets of the surveillance. What the journalists get is sort of friendly reminders and soft cues that they shouldn't be looking at certain stories, that they shouldn't be looking at some leads because there is no story there, of course. So they have more indirect cues and messages that they are somehow surveillance, that someone actually knows what are they working on, what are their stories, and what are their leads. Having that in mind, newsrooms have established several practices how to mitigate this situation. For example, they never leave their sensitive documents unattended. They erase documents from their computers. They use Signal or other safe application to communicate with their sources, or they prefer meeting their sources in person. They even suggested that they are willing to invest financial resources, which are very scarce, as you can imagine, to invest in upgrading their security purchasing some security cameras or investigating with some software and so on. The same research also showed that there are still much room for these practices to be improved because several journalists told us that they don't have any written procedures how to deal with sensitive sources. This is more like part of the culture of the newsroom. So mistakes could happen on the way, or the sources themselves are not aware of potential dangers or are not technologically savvy enough to use the sophisticated technology to safeguard their communication. So this actually just prompts us to think about more than we can do to raise the awareness, to share the know-how, and to somehow boost the knowledge and the resources of the news outlets and the journalists to protect themselves. All in all, we feel that we are basically alone in this matter. So launching the events like this and seeking for some sort of support groups is actually super important for us at this moment. The other things that I just wanted to mention briefly now, but maybe we can talk a little bit more in the rest of this panel, is actually that parallel to working with the journalists, we are launching several advocacy actions. And only last week, we had very fierce debate about law on police, which actually tried to push a legalization of biometric surveillance cameras through the back door, basically through the law on police, and the response of civil society and media sector in Serbia was so hard that they actually put the moratorium on this technology for 6 months, basically till the next elections. So we will see what will happen in the future. But if Nick mentioned something positive in this introduction, maybe I can put this advocacy action on the table.
Thanks, Tanya. Indeed, look, it is great to find civil society groups, media outlets, and defenders of media freedom finding common cause around an issue. And I think, historically, we found that when those groups align themselves around a mission to push for some kind of advancement in democratic rights or protections, they can be very effective together. But those coalitions have, in many places around the world, fallen apart in recent years, actually. So. I would say that is a small light of hope in this, and but otherwise, fairly grim depiction. The friendly reminders that you mentioned, it resonates strongly with what Sam has been saying about the spyware being used to kill the story. So that's a great illustration of just how entrenched these spying networks are, on the fabric of the internet that journalists depend upon for reporting their stories. That anonymity is no longer, a possibility for many journalists to pursue their stories. So what's to be done about all this? David Kaye, the former special rapporteur on freedom of expression, has called for a moratorium on the sale of commercial spyware. That may be a long time to come before we see an action of that nature, of that magnitude. In the meantime, Ron, do you have some thoughts on where there are steps that can be taken and earlier entry points for, at least bringing some form of regulation and order to this market?
Well, it's a tough problem to solve because, frankly, for most governments, this type of data is like crack, right? They're addicted to signals intelligence, and the more capabilities there are out there to do fancy things like this, the more they're interested in it. And every government in the world has some stake in this marketplace, and they depend on it. And I think, as Sam pointed out earlier, there is a knowledge transfer from the Western liberal democratic governments to this marketplace. And of course, the marketplace is going to grow more broadly globally. We haven't been talking about, for example, companies based in China that are offering these type of services. We had a massive report called Dark Basin not that long ago that attributed a worldwide cyber espionage campaign to a single small startup in Delhi, India called Beltrox, right? Offering hack for hire services, not to governments necessarily or exclusively, but to private companies, to private investigators. So the marketplace is just beginning. So how do we solve this? I sympathize with a call for a global moratorium. That's useful to punctuate the severity of the problem. Realistically, though, I doubt that something like that would happen because governments are so invested and law enforcement is so invested, intelligence agencies are so invested. So how do we square that circle? I think you have to start with the low-hanging fruit. One path forward might be to put pressure on Western liberal democratic governments and say, look, if you are going to be in this marketplace, you need to be more responsible. And what might that look like? Some people have talked about something like an allow and deny list for vendors. So in other words, France, Germany, Canada, US would commit publicly to only contract from vendors that do appropriate due diligence, that are more transparent, that don't sell to the Saudi Arabias of the world. That wouldn't solve the whole problem. It might, though, mitigate some of the extreme harms, and it would also maybe set a standard, and it would begin to marginalize companies like NSO Group. The other pathway forward, frankly, is litigation. So right now, WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, is suing NSO Group based on the 2019 zero-click exploit of WhatsApp that Citizen Lab was involved in investigating. If that litigation proceeds and there are stiff financial penalties against NSO Group, that might bring some greater accountability because shareholders will be reluctant to invest in a company, or they may impose some kind of real human rights due diligence over their sales. In order to do that properly, though, again, Western liberal democratic governments and other governments need to pass laws that enable victims and targets to be able to sue companies like NSO Group in their own jurisdictions. So famously, we identified a close confidant of Jamal Khashoggi, who's a Canadian permanent resident, Omar Abdulaziz. He's currently suing NSO Group in Israeli courts. That's probably not going to go anywhere. However, if Canada passed legislation that would enable someone like Omar to sue NSO Group and Saudi Arabia, foreign governments as well, in Canadian courts, that's a very simple thing to do, low-hanging fruit. None of this will solve the big problem. I think that's much more difficult, but it might in the short term bring some reprieve and at least show a pathway forward.
Ron, that's great. Really highlighting the importance of addressing this issue in the context of Western liberal democracies, where pressure can be applied on ethical procurement and sales and on laws to allow some form of redress. That seems like a very viable pathway. And in fact, and I'm sure Sam can talk about this in a little bit too, the EU has passed some regulations on the export of spyware, though perhaps not going as far as some would like, but it does, the report suggests that there may be an entry point there for further engagement, at least with the EU, in terms of building through its export laws, some way of providing oversight on the sale of these kinds of technologies abroad. But before we go back to the kind of regulatory and legal environment for this, this pressure on Western governments, of course, isn't going to be possible if we don't know what's happening. If journalists don't continue to reveal the extent of the abuse and the damages that it's causing. So Alia, I'd like to turn to you with this question. You've just completed this, wonderful collaborative research investigative project how easy is it to sustain this work? Is there a Pegasus Project 2 in the works? And what needs to happen to maintain that kind of work?
Well, I cannot talk about that, but what I can say, the idea of collaborations among journalists belonging to different organizations is ongoing, and I really cannot imagine the world without them right now, because I'll tell you where I'm standing, being in Beirut right now, the sense of immunity we get, the sense of a little bit, the sense of security that we get comes from the part that we are not exposed fully, that we are part of a bigger picture. Even I'll tell you, when I'm sitting in Beirut and we publish a story against people who are in power, they think twice before throwing us in prison or harming us. I can give you examples, but that would drift the conversation away. What I want to say, I think, and I agree, I don't want to repeat what Ron was saying. In the long term, there needs to be the big companies selling the technologies, and this is not only NSO, and there are even worse companies, including companies in the Middle East, in Dubai, for example. What needs to be there is that they need to know that the price to be paid for breaching human rights and privacy is larger than the money that they are making from their business. There needs to be a leverage there, and this is going to happen only by making them pay for it. Meanwhile, us as journalists, I think what we try to do is protect ourselves as much as possible. We are a small media in Beirut. We work with a lot of similar medias across the region. What we do, and we don't have technology or even the support that we need to protect ourselves. We work with other companies and other organizations in our areas. In Beirut, we work with a partner called SMEX. They help. Most of us are almost illiterate when it comes to what do we do now. So we find ourselves in situations that are complicated for us technically. We call our friends and we ask them, what do we do? They check our mobiles, they check our computers, they tell us, do this, don't do this, use this internet, don't use this internet, stuff like that. Until we are in a place where we get, and I'm telling you, Daraj is even in a better situation than most of the partners it works with. So most of the time we're working with even smaller organizations operating in Egypt, operating in Iraq, operating in Yemen, and it's really tough for most of these people. I'll go back a little bit to what Ron was saying. Don't forget, this all goes back to the Arab Spring, and surveillance is not the only thing that we have to deal with. You have to look at, for example, the armies that on social media, and this is like it's obvious and you can see it all over. The attacks are not limited. Even the laws here are related to the internet are against the journalists. So I think the ecosystem is very colorful. What we are seeing, I see a great value in all kinds of collaborations, because it makes, unlike the beginning of 2011 and the beginning of the Arab Spring, there is an infrastructure, and these coalitions are creating a sense that people who share the values and who have the skills, because the values alone are not alone, but putting all these skills together is allowing us, I'm not going to say to thrive, but at least to survive and move on to the next level, I think, while the conversation is happening in the democratic world about how to regulate this extremely, and not only for, this is really extremely dangerous for humanity.
Thanks, Alia. Look, there are some questions coming in. We are going to turn to the Q&A shortly, so please, keep posting your questions to that Q&A box. So Alia, you've pointed to the importance of supporting networks that support journalists in terms of their digital privacy and putting in place protections against these kinds of invasions of their privacy. And of course, your example highlights the importance of supporting investigative journalism that can bring these kinds of abuses to light. Tanya, could you also add a little bit from your perspective at the national and regional level? Iran is talking about putting pressure on Western governments. Alia has talked about what can be done with the outlets themselves. You have some interesting insights too about perhaps trying to make use of national laws to push back against these kinds of human rights abuses. What are your thoughts on that avenue for responding to this?
Yeah, well, drawing the knowledge from this last example that I just mentioned about the law, the withdrawal of the law on the police, I would also suggest looking into searching allies among CSO groups and CSO activists who can also be quite affected with the use of abuse of spyware. We are talking now from the perspective of media and journalists, but I'm pretty sure that CSO activists and all of people doing all kind of monitoring work are also targeted by this technology. Also forming alliances with human rights activists, especially the people like Alia just mentioned, who are savvy in protection of digital rights or privacy issues and so on, could be worthy talking to. Also, international media development organizations such as yourself, CIMA, our cooperation with CIMA is going on for years now, and it really was super useful and super helpful. For example, I talked to Sam when we were preparing this research at all, and it was really valuable for us to get this sort of insight and to share these sort of resources. At this point, we are basically building the case. So this level of usage of this technology and the disruptive effects that they have is relatively new situation for us. So at this point, we are in the situation that we need to build a case. We need to share the resources and to build the case for our decision makers, but also for our public. We need to explain what is actually going on and what kind of consequences it has, not only on journalists, not only on activists, but on society in large. And also, I would highly rely on general public, and we need to make our work as better, as professional as we can, so we can actually seek for the support from the public and explain, engage in promotional and educational work. So we would somehow get the support from the public and somehow pushed for this technology to be more transparent or more accountable, as Ron and Alia and Sam already mentioned in their talks.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Sam, I'd like to give you the last word before we open to Q&A. Your report documents some of the work that these international human rights groups like Article 19, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they are taking up this issue and making this, in some cases, a focal point of their advocacy or part of strategic litigation work. What did you walk away with? What impression did your research give you in terms of how effective those efforts are being and how they might be strengthened?
So I definitely think that they're gaining traction. Speaking as someone based in the UK, I don't think that public awareness of this issue has ever been higher, particularly because of the Pegasus projects earlier this summer. And we're seeing this come to light in political statements at the European Commission, the European Parliament, members of the United Nations, calling for the same things that a lot of these international advocacy groups are calling for. And that's great to see. And I think that what Ron was saying about the role of Western liberal democracies as being pivotal to reining in this industry and to introduce regulations of some sort is key. And I think that what's particularly difficult about this is that, like Ron said, that almost every state has a stake in this industry. I've looked at Spanish spyware manufacturing companies that have directly received funding from the European Union. There are companies based across Europe and within Western liberal democracies that are directly financially benefiting from their governments, as well as the fact that they are then getting, export licenses and their exports are being approved. So I think that that's one of the key challenges, and I think that in my report I differentiated between two loose kind of groups of or areas of advocacy, both advocating against those governments and companies exporting the technology, as well as the governments that are buying and misusing it. As I said, they're very loose, and actually they're very interrelated if you look at them, because the same governments exporting this technology are also buying it. Within the last month or so, it was revealed that Germany, police forces in Germany had bought NSO Group's technology. The year before, Spanish authorities have been accused of misusing this technology. This is not isolated to one area or one type of governance necessarily. We hear a lot about its misuse in repressive contexts, and rightfully so. But Western liberal democracies equally or similarly, involved in this industry and play a significant role. So within the report, I suggested that combining these disparate groups, or these kind of relatively different groups of entry points of advocacy is important, as well as ensuring that expertise is shared among different organizations. The likes of, in the UK, there's an organization called the Campaigns Against Arms Trade, and they have expertise related to the export of military equipment and the likes. And this subject touches on so many different aspects and so many different kind of, there are so many different entry points for advocacy to take place, that's why I think collaboration between multiple organizations is so important. But ultimately, I think this is an issue that Western liberal democracies are going to have to take up, even if that means it goes against their economic self-interest at times.
Great. Thanks very much, Sam. And thanks for such an excellent report, which we would, of course, strongly encourage everybody to take a look at. We have a few questions coming in. There's a few that cluster around some technological questions, including from Dagmar. So there's a series of questions asking what steps can be taken, aside from compartmentalizing your personal life from your professional journalistic life. What other technological steps can be taken to protect journalists? And how does a journalist know if they have been the target of one of these spyware attacks? I suspect Ron may have an answer to this question, but does anybody, please jump in.
Okay, well, I can take a crack at it. It's honestly, it is very, very difficult to find a technological way to protect yourself from this and other similar attacks. We haven't even spoken about the insecurity of the global cellular network. There are companies, sister companies to NSO Group, like Circles, that exploit insecure protocols in the cell network to identify the location and even intercept text messages and voice calls of any phone in the world. So, there really is no technological solution right now. I wish there was. I wish there was some app that I could say, hey, use this. But the whole point of this market is to get inside the device in order to bypass the protections that end-to-end encrypted apps provide. The best thing right now for journalists, I would say, is to A, be aware of the risks, B, advocate within your news organization to put resources into digital security, and then C, partner with investigatory groups like Amnesty International Security Lab and the Citizen Lab to at least try to identify whether hacking has occurred. And as we've shown, you can even do that retroactively. You can go back forensically and say, this device was hacked in 2018, if the data is there. And that will help at least raise awareness about the problem. Obviously, we can't go back to a time when everybody's pen and paper and meeting under trees and parks and that sort of thing. But even I tend to do that now. It's just a very difficult threat environment to defend against, which is why really regulation is the only viable answer here. Another one would be the tech platforms. You know, all of this is going through an infrastructure controlled by Google, Apple, Facebook, you know, Amazon Web Services, other hosting companies. They can see a lot, right? And I think we need to pressure the tech companies to realize that they have a responsibility to act as stewards over their customers who are being targeted in this manner. Some are being more and more helpful. Google has written blog posts about this. We've had good relations with some of the security teams at other companies, but they could be doing more proactively to deplatform some of these companies and the employees of the companies to make life harder for them. This doesn't solve the problem, but these are some steps that could be taken in the short term.
Thanks, Ron. And Tanya, I mean, you had mentioned actually that many journalists, you know, are going back to pen and paper in some ways. There is a return to old-fashioned technologies in Serbia that you've witnessed, isn't there?
Yeah, that's one of the answers that we got, or like agreeing with sources to leave the documents at certain location, and that journalists will go to that location and pick up the documents and so on. But what we found out is very much in line with what Ron just mentioned. Do what you, I mean, as I mentioned, we're feeling pretty much alone in this entire process. So entire baggage is on the newsrooms to capacitate themselves to come up with the resources and knowledge to deal with this issue. And this is one of the key messages that we got through this research. Basic protection of online communications and emails, correspondence, like using Proton Mail or using Signal, or that's it. What we can do at this point. Complicated technology and sophisticated applications that require knowledge, IT knowledge, engineering knowledge are not sustainable for the newsrooms. Neither journalists nor their sources have the capacities and knowledge to use this. So it's even if these types of technology exist, it's not applicable for majority of the newsrooms.
Yeah, and I mean, it's worth reminding folks too, this is happening at a time in which advertising revenue is an absolute free fall. So, you know, the news industry has never been weaker from a financial standpoint as digital markets, you know, through complicated ways, but end up siphoning all of the revenue that once went to news largely to the platforms and intermediaries that Facebook and Google primarily that control the digital advertising market. So a tough time to be shouldering such a heavy financial burden for many of these news outlets. There's another question from Jake. This is, I think Tanya and Alia would be probably best placed to field this one. As several African governments are now buying spyware tools and all their vendors come from the global north, is there anything that local activists and journalists can do to challenge this trend? So what, Tanya and Adia, do you have some advice for Jake on how to be a part of, you know, pushing back against this massive global industry and its the abuses that are occurring as a result of it?
Sorry, who is that directed to, Nick?
Oh, sorry. I thought Tanya or I may have cut out for a moment there. I thought Tanya or Alia might be well placed to give Jake some advice.
Yeah, I didn't see his note, but what journalists can do is actually do their job the best that they can do. So building evidences, building stories, researching. That's the first place that I would go to, and also it was mentioned several times before. Building coalitions, building alliances. As the problem is global, we need to also make our response more global. So combining all our local contexts together and building the case is maybe a way to go forward.
Anything to add, Alia?
I think Alia may have dropped off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, we'll move to there's two more questions I'll put to the group here. There's about strategic litigation, and perhaps Sam, you may have some input on this. There's a question with regard to what forms of strategic litigation are being used by activist groups to push back against the spyware industry, aside from the WhatsApp litigation that we've described versus NSO previously. And to add to that, another question that's really interesting is whether there is an ethical use of commercial spyware, or, you know, in an ideal world, if this should in fact be banned in a moratorium, as David Kay has suggested.
Great, thanks. In terms of strategic litigation, I think Reporters Without Borders are currently representing a number of journalists that have been targeted with spyware in Paris. And there have been other examples. Other examples in which organizations have represented those, but the overall picture is that the methods for redress are lacking globally. In terms of the ethics of ever, you know, is there ever an ethical reason to use it? I think whether it's ethical or not, I think that there's a lack of regulation that makes that using it proportionally and, you know, within human rights framework unlikely at the moment. And I think that's why there's been a call for a global moratorium on its use. And until there is regulation surrounding its use and its sale and more transparency, I think it's very hard to argue that in its current state there is an ethical way in which it can be used.
Right. So just reiterating the point Ron had made earlier on this question of litigation, until there are laws allowing foreign organizations to essentially sue these spyware companies for the use of their technologies against people, it's going to be very difficult to find an avenue for this kind of strategic litigation to be effective. I think was Ron's point earlier, and as a response to this particular question. But Ron, do you want to, anything else you'd like to add to either of these questions about strategic litigation or the ethics, you know, whether there's an ethical use for spyware?
Nothing really to add. I'd just point out, I put it in the chat there, we do maintain this resource that might be helpful to some people, where we just compile every case regarding litigation around commercial spyware, not just with NSO, but other vendors as well. And you're right, there needs to be a law or laws in place that protect people who are targeted, allow them some redress legally, and that's certainly doable. That's something that countries like Canada could do. You know, speaking of Canada, we have virtually no export controls over our own surveillance industry, and that's really quite shameful. There's a story out in CBC today about former Prime Minister Stephen Harper working for a Canadian surveillance company that does facial recognition, peddling that gear to the United Arab Emirates. Like, you know, this is a country that's a serial abuser of surveillance technology. Terrible human rights track record. That just shouldn't happen. Like that there's no reason that should happen in that manner. As for the ethics of this industry, you know, I think there's a fundamental problem with a service that relies on identifying and not disclosing software flaws that most of society relies on. Like that's the ethical problem with this industry. So, you know, we at the Citizen Lab have routinely identified in the course of our research software flaws in major products, including the one we're using right now, Zoom. We discovered that it was flawed in very significant ways that put users at risk. We disclose that to the company. Companies like NSO Group don't do that. That's their intellectual property, as they're harboring these software vulnerabilities, as do many of their clients, the government clients, NSA, GCHQ, etc. That's what they do. So we need some kind of disclosure process around this, starting with governments. There needs to be more transparency about when and under what circumstances they'll withhold knowledge of software flaws that the public depends on, because frankly, that's a public safety risk. right? And there needs to be a healthy debate about that. So I do believe this entire industry is flawed, it's unethical, but it is growing nonetheless. Yeah, so just a few comments.
Yeah, and just a reminder that, I mean, the whole industry, as Sam has reminded us, has emerged from, of course, the, shady, sometimes necessarily obscured activities of intelligence work, and has brought with it that culture of secrecy, but into an environment in which there's a lot at stake for the public now. So that culture obviously has to change. This has been great. There's one point a broad point that I'd like to make from CIMA's perspective. Dan O'Malley's work has really brought a lot of light to, for us at CIMA and for others in our community, that those concerned with media development, it's a reminder that we really need to be paying much more attention to these global questions of how we govern the internet and digital technologies, that there's just a tremendous amount at stake for how people obtain and disseminate information and free speech, including through commercial media outlets and journalism. So we have to be really paying much more attention to these questions of internet governance. And this is just a stark reminder of that. So thanks very much. I don't see any more questions coming in, and Dan can correct me if they do, but before we close, I thought it would be good to give everybody, the panelists, a final word and perhaps an opportunity to do some shout outs. Many of you have mentioned friends and allies and partners along the way, and I'm sure our audience would appreciate hearing from your perspectives the organizations that are invaluable in this, and also, to Ron, perhaps if he jumps in, a question on whether the Citizens Lab and other forensic labs need to be, franchised in some way. Do we need many more of these around the world? Would that be, part of the solution? But Tanya, Aliyah, and Sam, do you want to give a few shout outs and maybe make a final comment?
Well, maybe I can start with really huge thank you for all of you for being here, for having the opportunity to talk and to share experiences. For us, this is definitely the question which I don't have final answers to, and something that we will definitely looking into much more in the years to come. We might, during this process, be successful, hopefully. But speaking about shout outs, I think it's super important really to say thanks to everyone who's recognized this problem and who values the question of solidarity in this matter. In our domestic field in Serbia, there are really some excellent local CSO organizations who are very much aware of the various security risks, of the financial risks, of risks to privacy issues, and on let's say global international level. I would really like to say thanks to Ned, to CIMA, to colleagues working in other international media development organizations such as RSF, such as Article 19. These are actually the first addresses that we would go to if we encounter some problems. Citizen Lab, of course, thank you. We are preparing follow-up monitoring reports, and we use their data very much. Yeah, I think forming this sort of broader coalition is so far the only way forward that I can think about, and definitely something that we need to have discussions more often that we are doing at the moment. Thank you.
Ali, you've been able to rejoin us. Can you hear us all right?
Yes, and I'm sorry I was interrupted for a few minutes. I had a power cut. I think what I would add to what Tanya was saying is strategy, if I have to think about what we're really looking at a world that is becoming increasingly more scary by the minute, probably. We're looking at the corporate world, we're looking at governments, we're looking at huge interests, and we are in the front rows to protect what is most important, not only to us as journalists, but to individuals everywhere in this everywhere around the world. So I think more strategy instead of just, and it's been an amazing experience to be part of the Forbidden Stories collaboration, but it opened our eyes to how much also it could be done and how much is happening. Daraj as an independent media would not have existed if it weren't for the belief of people that believe that these things could happen. Independent media could exist, collaborations could happen, fighting back could happen. The picture today, as scary as it is a little bit where we're standing, a little bit less scary, because we're not only on the receiving end, we are in a position to fight back. So I think to everybody that has made that possible, partners and donors, etc. Of course, more of that, I think.
Great. Well, we're finishing here on a very inspiring note. Sam, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, we're all indebted to the work of Citizen Lab, and the research that I did wouldn't have been possible without the research that they've done. I think as a kind of final thing, investigative journalists as one of the primary targets of this technology, and also as one of the primary people and actors that are able to unearth evidence and contracts and, you know, shed some light on this horrendously opaque industry. I think that they need to be at the center of discussions going forward, both in terms of how this industry is regulated and also how people that have been negatively affected can seek redress.
Great. Ron, any final words?
Yeah, well, thanks for the kind words about the Citizen Lab. We're part of a community, and we really couldn't be doing this without that community. So groups like Access Now, Human Rights Watch, RSF, Article 19, everybody's involved in this together. R3D in Mexico, they're local groups that we partner with that we just couldn't do the work that we do without them. And I think that's important to understand that, you know, talking about franchises and so on, Amnesty Security Lab recently emerged and is doing very similar work to Citizen Lab. We collaborate with them. Helped with the Pegasus project and coordinate as best we can. We definitely could use more organizations doing this type of work. In fact, it's not rocket science. You know, I'm doing this, we're doing this from the basis of the university, right? It's an academic project for us. There's really no reason other universities couldn't mount similar efforts. This is not, you know, secret stuff that we're doing. We publish all of our methods quite openly. And I just wish that other faculty would take on this initiative, see the importance of it for free expression and open and secure internet.
Well, look, thanks, Ron, Tanya, Sam, Alia, thanks so much for being with us today. And a very special thank you to Dan O'Malley for organizing the report and the event, and to Anne for also supporting us on this event. And of course, again, for Sam for penning such an excellent report for CIMA. We look forward to continuing this conversation. CIMA and Ned will definitely continue to pay a lot of attention to this and other challenges. So everyone have a terrific day, and we shall carry on this conversation another time. Thanks so much.